guys, this is Rebecca. I wanted to share my project about a statistical research test that I would try to use. So my project is called Effectiveness of Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing, or otherwise known as EMDR, on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in sex trafficking survivors. I wanted to provide a little bit of background on my project. It might be a little small to see, so I'll kind of go ahead and give you some of the what it says on the slides. So many people experience trauma in their lives, and a person's brain either processes the trauma or the trauma is held in the amygdala, which is a portion of the brain, until the person can process it. Post-traumatic stress, or PTSD, is defined as something that occurs when a person has experienced or witnessed a traumatic event, such as a natural disaster, a serious accident, a terrorist act, war combat, rape, or other violent personal assault, and that is taken from the American Psychiatric Association. Common symptoms of PTSD include anxiety, emotional numbness, avoidance of places or people that are associated with the trauma, difficulty sleeping, nightmares, and flashbacks. And it's grouped into three categories. So the symptoms, flashbacks, which is re-experiencing the traumatic event, avoiding situations or things similar to the traumatic events, and atomic nervous system hyperarousal. So those are the three different categories. And longevity and severity of the trauma impact PTSD symptoms in a person. So that's taken from Farley. And all the references are at the end. The flashbacks are debilitating and can occur at any moment, especially when triggered randomly. And one way to gauge the PTSD symptoms in a person is through the minimization of the number of flashbacks. They are a strong indicator and measure to test in relation to PTSD. I have personally worked with sex trafficking survivors for many years, and they would randomly have triggers throughout, periods of life, throughout the day as we were going to do things, or at home, at night. And for example, one survivor that I worked with, we were driving in a car one day, and she saw this truck, and she instantly exclaimed that she was afraid and she wanted to leave the area as soon as possible. I did not question her, but instead drove the car in a very different direction, away from the truck. And we weren't even supposed to go that direction, but I knew that there was a reason she was stating these things. What turned out to be later on, she did explain that her pimp used to drive that same exact type of truck with the model and the color. So it triggered her, and she thought that it was his truck. She thought that he found her. It was a flashback to, times that she had been in that truck or seen him in that truck near her. And so in that moment, she was unable to do anything but she wanted to leave the situation. I feel like gauging flashbacks is a helpful way to measure if PTSD is improving, and that's why I kind of chose this as the measure of the test. There's adequate research that flashbacks are a key indicator of PTSD symptoms, and some of the research that I found, it says that research in PTSD has yielded important insights with respect to flashbacks, which are a key symptom of this debilitating disorder. That's taken from Kovlezowski. And another article mentions that people with PTSD experience one or major symptoms that include flashbacks, and that source is from Wilma Lasana. So if we go to the next slide, I just give a little bit more in the background. There are a few types of treatment that have been known to be helpful for people experiencing PTSD. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is a form of talk therapy, exposure therapy, and EMDR, and that's taken from the Mayo Clinic. Since there's a lot of research done on the effectiveness of EMDR for people suffering from trauma, I feel that there is a basis to do this study. I wanted to, in the future, I would like to again walk alongside sex trafficking survivors, and so this topic kind of interested me. I'd be interested in seeing how using EMDR as a treatment method affects a person who has post-traumatic stress disorder. I've had personal experience with seeing in my own life the positive effects of EMDR after experiencing a few decades of spiritual abuse and PTSD. And so it's more than just, EMDR is more than just talk therapy. It uses external stimulus to help a person process their memories. And they're most commonly, it's therapist-directed lateral eye movements often is what is used, or they could use hand tapping and audio stimulation that I have cited there as Shapiro. And it's a well-researched, EMDR is well-researched to help people who have PTSD, is one of the top ones listed. And it would be interesting to see if it truly helps sex trafficking survivors who have PTSD. According to Abbas Alvistrashi, Prince, Gorsias, Tribuk, and Oram, evidence-based interventions for PTSD, such as trauma-focused CBT and EMDR, should be used for women survivors of human trafficking who are ready to talk about their trauma. Another article by Hussein, Zimmerman, Abbas, Light, and Watts state that sexual violence during trafficking was associated with increased risk of PTSD. So I felt like, using my study to gauge the PTSD using EMDR was a good source to do. And I wanted to see if it was applicable in the type of work I want to do in the future with sex trafficking survivors. Another thing that I learned, throughout this class is we need to look at the research done, but also test on our own to assure that we're following ethical standards and providing evidence-based practice. So I wouldn't want to go based off just my personal experience, which is why I wanted to kind of give some background as to why I chose this topic to research and to set up a potential study. I want to work with sex trafficking survivors again in the future, so it would be helpful to know, is EMDR helpful? If so, I would refer them to resources where EMDR is used, or if I were to ever become licensed in that way, to do it myself. So that's why I felt like this test might be important. So this slide just shows the research question, hypotheses, and variables. So the general research question, does EMDR help a person who has PTSD from sex trafficking successfully process the trauma and lessen the symptoms of the PTSD flashback? That's the question. I chose a one-tailed hypothesis. People who have PTSD from sex trafficking will see improvements with their flashbacks if they utilize EMDR in their treatment than those who have received just talk therapy as part of their treatment. The null hypothesis, there's no relationship between the type of treatment and improvement in the number of PTSD flashbacks in sex trafficking survivors. The independent variable, the treatment, which is in case the EMDR talk therapy, and the dependent variable, improvement in the number of PTSD flashbacks related to sex trafficking. As with all statistical tests, identifying the variables and hypotheses are crucial. For this test, I looked strictly only at sex trafficking survivors who have access to talk therapy and EMDR therapy. This rules out of the control group, so due to this, I would choose the first test would be the independent t-test. If there was a control group, which would be no therapy, I would use an ANOVA. But after reviewing literature and other studies, I would like my hypothesis to be one-tailed, which means that I want to predict the association between the attribute of one variable and the attribute of another variable. And I feel like this hypothesis would clearly reveal my independent and dependent variables and set up this test well. So, like I mentioned, the first test I would do is an independent t-test. I would try this to set this up, and so there are many reasons that I chose this type of test. The first reason, independent t-tests are only utilized for two groups and no more than two groups, so I feel like in this, what I chose and how I set it up, that's a good side for an independent t-test. The two groups are not related. in the sense that they do not have people from one group mixed with another. That's important for an independent t-test. You can't have both of them mixed in some way, because that then would make the test, the results inaccurate. Also, and third reason, independent t-tests are used to test the differences between the means of two interventions often. I took that from Kent State University as a source. In my test, I'd like to see the results of the talk therapy group and the group that is given the EMDR. And that's how I'd be able to either accept or reject the null hypothesis. This type of test also looks at the difference in the t and the p-value, which are bound to happen because the groups are unrelated. And then it tries to see the likelihood of sampling error created by the differences. And this test, for these few reasons, I wanted to explain a little more about this. The one that makes the most sense, it would be if there was a normal distribution. And so this would be if there was a normal distribution of the data. I would use this test because they're utilized often to compare two treatment or intervention groups. And I found that through research a lot. The hypothesis is definitely trying to evaluate interventions in my case. And furthermore, two groups, they're not influenced by participants in either respective group. Or else the p-value would be incorrect. And so each sample has different members only specific to that sample. Additionally, the independent t-tests look at the differences in the t and p-values, like I mentioned, to see sampling error. So I would want to make sure to conduct, the test for the t and p-values to test my null hypothesis. And this test hinges on both of those being calculated correctly and accurately. If the difference was smaller, the p-value is higher and the null can't be rejected. And then obviously the vice versa. Then if it were higher, then we could keep it. So if it were smaller, there would be no true relationship between the variables. So on the opposite end, like I said, if there's a low p-value, the sample reviews a true relationship in statistical significance. So the next slide goes for a few more reasons as why I would choose the independent t-test. Another reason, my dependent variable would be interval or ratio level variable. I would utilize a test to measure how many flashbacks the clients have within a certain time frame, such as days or weeks, and this can include 0, so that's important for this type of test. There are only, another reason, there are only 2 types of treatments. So the independent variable is dichotomous, which is a criteria for independent t-tests. Another reason that this test would be great is the independent t-tests do not require the same number of cases in each group, and this can be in part due to ethical considerations with treatments. So when, with all this, it can be hard to get the same number in both groups just because, talk therapy is utilized a little more than EMDR at times, and so it might be hard to we can't just randomly decide, like, I'm going to assign both groups to have the same number of people. In this case, we want to consider ethical things. And going back to the interval level ratio, I would want to make sure that I could test something that would be, for the independent t-test, they have to have an interval or ratio level variable, and so I would want to make sure that it could be 0 flashbacks in a certain amount of time, all the way up to however many number. And another point that I make here, the survivors need to be part of a treatment that is appropriate for them. So that's why it would also be hard to just say, well, 30 can be from EMDR and 30 from talk, because it has to be something that they choose and they feel comfortable with. We want to be making sure that we're ethical. In the samples, another criteria of an independent t-test are that the samples are random. I did not choose a specific people. So to make sure that the ethical standards are being followed and there's validity. So with that, out of this random selection, I would choose as many who give their consent to participate in testing for each group. And various types of talk therapy tend to be, like I said, a little more used and well known. So, one example that I could take 50 from talk therapy and maybe only 44 from EMDR. And so that's a real, that was one of the real key things for me when considering this type of test is, I know that EMDR is not used as often. We hear more about talk therapy. And so I would want to be careful with that, and so that's one of the reasons I thought this test would be good as well. So then the other test that I would do is if there was not a normal distribution, then there would be another type of test which is comparable or comparable to the independent t-test for non-parametric testing. So that would be the Mann-Whitney U-test. So if the dependent variable is not parametric or normally distributed, I would use the Mann-Whitney test. It looks at the differences of the measurements of the dependent variable in the two samples to see if there's sampling error. The independent t-test, it does the same thing. So it's just a different parametric versus non-parametric. In this case, it might be more effective to utilize the Mann-Whitney U-test because the sample sizes might be smaller. And that could likely happen, depending on how many are familiar with EMDR. That could be a very small sample size, and we have to be careful of that to make sure that the testing is accurate and not going to be skewed by sample size. A source that I found from Hart says that is a good test to use when looking at intervention treatment effectiveness. It's sometimes used for the comparing the I can never say this word, the efficacy of two treatments in clinical trials. When looking at the sample size, it's often the Mann-Whitney U-test is often used with smaller independent samples. And according to Weinbeck and Grinnell, this test is often used in research studies involving two small independent subsamples. So I thought, well, if there's not enough people, in the sample sizes for the independent t-test, this could be a good alternative. And one interesting thing to note when I was researching about this test is that it looks at the shape in the median. It wants to see if certain variables higher than the other variable. And that's how it specifically measures the variables to test the hypothesis. So these are my references, which you'll get in the presentation of the research that I had, and that is my project. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope that you have a wonderful evening. Please let me know if you have any questions.